Alrighty guys, so in today's lecture we're going to be talking about a specific type of organic compounds called neurotransmitters. Now I'm sure you guys have heard about this already in your HBS class, but I'm just going to go over the basics of the nervous system. That way you kind of know what neurotransmitters are and how they're used by your body. So very simply put, the nervous system is a highly complex system in your body, and it allows you to coordinate actions and sensory information. And the way that it does that is by transmitting signals to and from different parts of the body. So for example, let's say that there is a truck moving towards you. Please don't judge my drawings. There's a truck moving towards you, and the light is going to go to your eyes, and it's going to get transmitted by your brain, and your brain is going to send a signal down to your legs to tell you to get out of the way. And so that's basically how your nervous system works, very simply. Or for example, if you touch like a fire, your hand is going to send a signal to your brain that you're touching something hot, and then your brain is going to communicate back to your hand to get your hand out of the way. And so I'm sure you guys have all experienced touching something hot before, and you know how quickly your hand just reflexively moves it away. And so your nervous system can work very quickly. Okay, so your nervous system is made out of cells called neurons. And so neurons, they look a little different from your typical cell. In biology, you learn about how your cells, you usually learn about it like this, but cells can differ in shape depending on what they're used for. And neurons, they tend to look like this. I'm not going to go over the parts of the neuron because I'm sure you learn it more in detail in biology and human body systems. But what we need to know is that your neurons can communicate with each other through an electrical signal called an action potential. So let's say this neuron is sending a signal to this neuron right here. The way that it does that is by using neurotransmitters, which is the topic for today. Now, the magic of neurotransmitters happens right here. You see where they connect together. This is kind of like a zoomed up view, and the area that they connect, two neurons connect, is called the synaptic cleft. And so if you guys notice in this picture right here, there's a little space between the two neurons where they touch. And so the space where the two neurons touch is called the synaptic cleft. And this is where neurotransmitters do their magic. What happens is the neuron that has the signal, it communicates with the second neuron, the one that it wants to send a signal to, by sending these chemicals from this cell to this cell. Now there's little receptors on the cell that's receiving the communication, and so the neurotransmitter goes from this cell into the receptor, and that way this second neuron gets the message and is able to send the message to other neurons, to your muscles, things like that. And so what we need to know basically is that the neurotransmitters work in the synaptic cleft. They're molecules, very small molecules that work in this synaptic cleft, and they send messages to and from neurons. Okay, so very simply put, the definition for neurotransmitters, they're chemical messengers, and so again, they send messages in the synaptic cleft from one neuron to the other, and the neurotransmitters send messages from neurons to muscles, to glands, or to other nerves. Okay, and so neurotransmitters are basically the chemicals that send messages in your body. Alright, so for today's assignment, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be studying and doing some research on different neurotransmitters. And so I have an example problem right here. So for your assignment today, I'm just going to give you the name and the chemical structure of different neurotransmitters, and you're just going to have to do some research on them using Google, just like we did last time. Now it is going to be a little bit different because if you notice, there's more things to look up, and so just make sure that you guys, if you are unconfident in doing some research on your own, that you guys follow along. That way you know the quality and the quantity of the research that I'm expecting you to produce for today's assignment. So here we have the structure and the name for our neurotransmitter, and it's called dopamine. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of this chemical before. Now dopamine, the first thing we're going to look for is the chemical formula. And so very simply, all we have to do is we just need to pull up Google, So I have Google pulled up and I have it typed up already. All you have to do is write the chemical name, so dopamine, and we just need to write chemical formula. So we have that right here, and I'm just going to enter it. And there we go. We have the chemical formula for dopamine. So dopamine, it looks like it is going to be C8H11NO2. Okay, so very simple. First box, just the chemical formula, and all you need to do is Google it. Now the second box is how many of each element are in this molecule. This one's going to require you to do a little bit more thinking than the previous one, but it should be pretty simple. We talked about how to do this before winter break, but all we need to do is look at the chemical formula and just look at the numbers, the small numbers, the subscripts behind the element. So here we have C, and so if you look on your periodic table, you'll see that C is carbon, and if you notice the number behind C is 8. So we're going to have 8 carbons. All right, for the next one, we have H. We know that H is hydrogen, and the number behind it is 11. So we have 11 hydrogens. All right, we have the capital letter N, but N doesn't have a number behind it, which means that there's only one. So we have 1 nitrogen. And then lastly, we have O, which is oxygen, and there's a number 2 behind it, so we're just going to write 2 oxygens. All right, there we go. So we have our, we know how many of each element make up this molecule dopamine. Dopamine is made out of 8 carbons, 11 hydrogens, 1 nitrogen, and 2 oxygen. All right, the next thing we're going to do is look at the functional groups. So I'm just going to pull this down and bring up the functional groups chart. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the structure of dopamine right here, and we're going to look for the functional groups on the chemical. So let's just look through it. So we notice that we have OH right here, and we have OH right here. And we notice that both OHs are connected to carbons, a carbon chain. And so it's connected to R. So if we look here, we're going to notice that the functional group alcohol is OH, which is connected to R, a carbon chain. So it looks like we have 1, 2 alcohols. So right here on the left side, we have alcohol and alcohol. So on the functional groups, I'm just going to write that dopamine has 2 alcohols. As we move towards the right, you're going to notice that we have a closed shape right here that's made of only carbons, and we know that is going to be a carbon ring. So we're going to write 1 carbon ring. And then as we move towards the right again, we're going to see that there's a nitrogen, an NH2. So if we look for nitrogen, there's only 2 functional groups that have nitrogen, either an amine or an amide, but an amide needs a carbon double bonded to an O. But if you notice, this one doesn't have that. It just has NH2, so we know that it's going to be an amine. So we know that our final functional group is 1 amine. All right. Next, what you're going to do is you're just going to Google and you're going to find information, more information about your neurotransmitter. So first, you're going to look up what does the body use your neurotransmitter for. So you can either type that question directly into Google, like what does the body use dopamine for, or you can just look up dopamine on Google and find that information. Now, just to save time so you don't have to go through watch me do the entire research process, I pulled up the information already, but here we go. We have a website. Looks like it's WebMD, so it's not the most accurate, but it does give you some basic information. So dopamine, it plays a role in how we feel pleasure. So what does the body use for? We can write that dopamine plays a role in how we feel pleasure. So things like when you eat and you feel good, when you sleep and you feel good, when you reproduce and you feel good, that is all regulated by this neurotransmitter dopamine. Okay, it also says that it's a big part of our ability to think and plan. Okay, so plays a role. Actually, I'll just use commas. How we feel pleasure, think, and plan. Okay. All right, so that's pretty good for what the body uses it for. Obviously, every neurotransmitter has many different uses, and it can get very complex, but at least for the scope of this class, we can keep it pretty simple. Just generally what the neurotransmitter does is totally fine. All right, next we're going to look up what happens if you have too much of that chemical. Because every neurotransmitter, there needs to be a balance in it. There's problems if you have too much of it, but also problems if you have too little of it. So first we're going to look up what happens if you have too much. So here I did some research again, and it says that if you have too much dopamine, or if you have too much dopamine in some parts of the brain but not in other parts, it looks like you can become too competitive. You can become too aggressive. All right, and it leads to poor impulse control. So you're not able to control your impulses. Okay, so it looks like it could lead to other conditions that include ADHD, binge eating, addiction, gambling. So let's write things like that: ADHD, binge eating, addiction, and gambling. All right, so all these things can be caused if you have too much dopamine in your body. All right, and then lastly, let's look up what happens if you have too little dopamine, so a deficiency or a deficit. So a dopamine deficiency is related to certain medical conditions. Looks like it is connected to depression, to Parkinson's disease, and so that would be good. Okay. All right, so that's pretty much it. That's about the amount of research that I want you to do for today's assignment. So it's not too much, but I do want to make sure that you guys get a good overview of what each of the neurotransmitters on your assignments do, what happens if there's too much, too little. Just make sure you guys find the functional groups and the chemical formulas. Okay, so I am on the Zoom call, so let me know if you guys have any questions, but we'll see you guys next time.